In the last lesson, we started setting up our user interface and we created this canvas, placed our image onto it, and also on top of that, put some text. This is how far we've gotten. And we want to now complete setting up the user interface. So adding in some more components. And we want it to end up looking a bit like this, with a label at the top, a big bit of text, some buttons at the bottom, and also a label that keeps track of how many Pomodoros we've done. So each 25-minute work session gets us a check mark. So you're going to be using a lot of the stuff that you learned in yesterday's lessons in terms of which Tkinter widgets to use and how to set them up in order to create this. So it's going to be a challenge for you. But before we get started, there's just a couple of things I want to point out. So one thing to note is that we've got this BG, which stands for background color, and we've used our constants up here to set those background colors. Now you can see that here I've got the label and also the check mark in a green color. And that color comes from our constant right here. So you'll be able to color a piece of text in a label, not by using BG, but by using FG, which stands for foreground. And that you can basically set to equal the green color that we've got. And as long as that's added to the label, then you should be able to see that show up. Now, the other thing I want to show you is if you don't know how to get hold of a check mark, the easiest way is just to go onto Wikipedia and find the particular check mark that you like, and then just copy it and paste it into here as the text. So for example, if we had a label which had a text argument and I copy that check mark and I paste it here, then that check mark is what's going to show up on screen. Now, the final thing I want to mention before I let you get on with the challenge is that we've packed our canvas onto the screen. But as we've got quite a few things that we need to lay out on the screen, it's much easier to do this using the grid. So I want you to change the canvas to using the grid system. And here I've created a more or less sort of breakdown of how that grid might look like. So you probably will end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 rows and 3 columns, and have a think about how you might lay out the labels and the buttons and the check marks relative to those rows and columns. Keeping this page on screen, I want you to pause the video and give this challenge a go. And if you don't know the sizes for things or the fonts, don't worry, just guess them. It doesn't really matter. As long as you've got the rough layout and the correct widgets, then that would be considered a win. Pause the video now and give it a go. All right, so I'm going to get started by creating this top label here. And that I'm going to call the title label, and that's going to be created from the label class. Now, the text in this is just going to read timer for now. And I want to change its color by using the foreground keyword argument. And I'm going to change it to that green color that we've got up here. Now I want to be able to show that label on screen, so I have to give it some form of layout. And as we mentioned, we're going to use the grid system. So I'm going to change the grid. And if we refer to this image, you can see there's going to be 3 columns. This is going to be in the middle column, and then it's going to be on the first row. So we're going to start from 0. So I'm going to say column equals 1 and row equals 0. Now I have to change this canvas pack because otherwise it's going to give me an error. And in terms of where the canvas is, it's going to be again in the same column as that label, but it's going to be on the next row. So column 1, row 1. And now when I run it, you can see our label shows up and then our canvas shows up, and it's all correctly positioned. Now I want to change this label so that it looks a little bit more like the demo that I showed you, like this. So I have to change the font and the text to make it a lot bigger. As we've seen before, we can simply add the font when we create the label. So we can set that to a tuple, and first I'm going to use my font name that I've got as a constant, which I've used when I created the text. It's just going to be Courier. And then in terms of the size, you can simply just make a guess. It's going to be something pretty large. So I'm going to go with 50. And I'm not going to have it bold or italic or anything. So that's the end of that font. And now when I run it again, you can see it's a lot bigger and it looks a lot more like the example that we had here. But the only difference is that it actually still has a white background. Instead of just changing the foreground, I'm also going to change the background, and I'm going to make it the same yellow color that I have in the background of the window. So now it looks like it's all blended in and it's all a part of the same application. Let's move on to the next row, which is going to be our buttons. So I'm going to have a start button and I'm also going to have a reset button. And they're both going to be created from the button class. The start button is just going to have the text start, and the reset button is going to have the word reset. The start button's also going to be laid out on our grid, and it's going to be column 0, row 2. And the reset button is going to be column 2, row 2. So now you can see the start and the reset buttons are now on the next row after the canvas, and it's either side of it. Now notice how there's a little bit of a white background around each of the buttons. If that bothers you, then you can actually fix that by doing the same thing that we did with the canvas, which got rid of the border, by changing that highlight thickness to 0. And because that's really prone to typos, I'm actually just going to paste it in. So now you can see that white border has pretty much all but disappeared. Now we're on to our very final thing that we showed, which is the check mark right here. So I'm going to call it check marks because eventually there'll probably be quite a few of them, hopefully, if we do lots of good work. And our label is going to have the text, which is going to have the check mark. Now, if you're on a Mac, you can actually go into Edit and go to Emojis and Symbols and pick a check mark from here. But on Windows, you can simply just use the trick that I showed you. Go ahead and copy and paste it from a piece of text, say like Wikipedia. Once we've got our text, I'm going to change the foreground color of that text again, and I'm going to change it to green. And it's also going to require a background color of yellow, just so that we get rid of the white. And finally, I'm going to add this on using the grid, setting the column to 1 and the row to 3. So this is basically going to be in the last row. So you can see after all of that work, we've finally managed to complete the user interface. And we've now achieved the final look. And all we need to do now is to actually add the timer functionality, which we'll do in the next lesson. Now, if you found any of the Tkinter widgets difficult to use, or you got stuck, or you couldn't figure out certain things about it, then be sure to have a review of yesterday's lessons where we talked about the widgets in more detail.